If you do an internet search on Emmett Till, you can see photographs of what he looked like when his mom saw him. Why did this murder matter so much to the African American community and the movement for civil rights? Why, for many African Americans, was this the spark that ignited the civil rights movement? First, the brutality was visible. The brutality was visible, and it was done to a child. Emmett's courageous mother refused to use a closed casket. 50,000 people viewed the 14-year-old's body before he was buried. The image of Emmett's mutilated and distorted face was printed in papers and magazines across the country. His mother forced white and black America to look at what had been done to her child. This murder could not be ignored. She wouldn't let it happen. She touched a nerve and unified a people. The second reason the murder mattered so much to the African American community was its timing. It happened 1 year after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling that on paper ended segregation in education. 1954 was an exciting moment, and the popular expectation was that segregation in housing, transportation, and jobs was now fall like dominoes. Emmett's kidnapping and murder was a wake-up call. A court ruling in their favor wasn't enough. Emmett's murder showed how the South would strike back at civil rights. Says Charles Ogletree, noted Harvard Law School professor and founder of the school's Institute for Race and Justice, Emmett Till was a shocking rebuttal to what we thought was the dawn of racial progress in the United States. Emmett Till was the touchstone of whites saying, okay, we have tolerated enough talk of equality, and now we're fighting back. And they fought back with resistance, with closing schools, with bombings, with burnings, with the Klan playing a major role. Emmett Till was the start of that new battle. The third reason the murder mattered was the travesty of justice that followed the killing. Although African American witnesses placed Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam at Emmett's uncle's home when he was abducted, and witnesses placed them both at the barn where Emmett was killed, the all-white jury of peers found them innocent of the murder charges. A later grand jury found insignificant evidence to even charge them with the lesser charge of kidnapping. African Americans realized anew that the local justice system would never allow the winds of change to shift in their favor unless a massive, organized, resistant movement was coordinated. In short, African Americans realized that they would have to do more than trust the government to bring about the change that was needed. They needed to take matters in their own hands and force the issue into the daily life of America. And that's what happened. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were acquitted on September 23, 1955, 26 days after the murder. 2 months and 2 weeks after the verdict, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. A few days after, the Montgomery bus boycott began. And then Martin Luther was called in to take up visible leadership of the civil rights movement. I wonder why so few of us tell this story. I really didn't know the details until I did the research for the sermon. Why hasn't Emmett Till and the aftermath been seared into the memory of our children and our culture? Why has Rosa Parks and her bus ride been remembered and the torture and murder of Emmett Till been tucked away? Part of the reason I suggest is because the Rosa Parks story is neat, tidy, and has a happy ending. Rosa ultimately wins the day. Emmett, in contrast, dies a terrible death and his blood splatters on the hands of white America. What follows his murder is a travesty of justice that remains unresolved to this day, although just recently the justice system has reopened the case. There's something too terrible, too inhuman, too unfinished, too messy about that moment in our national history. And forgetting is part of how we handle the history of civil rights in our country. I think of what we've done to Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King Day. It's now a day to remember racial equality, but we've stripped away the parts of King's message that we don't like to hear. His charge against the Vietnam War and his call against war of any kind. We've stripped away his call for economic justice and equality, access to all manner of things, including health care. Professor Charles Ogletree, the noted African-American scholar and legal expert, said in a recent panel discussion at Harvard University, Emmett Till is an ugly part of American history that we've swept under the rug. We see a little demonstration here. We see some dogs occasionally, the fire hoses, but the enormity and the immensity, the immense nature of the racial violence of the 1950s and 60s is unfortunately only a footnote in American history. He continues saying, I wish there was a way we could bring it back so that we can realize that this country, from Washington, D.C., all the way down to the capitals of the southern states, played an incredible role in tolerating one of the greatest examples of racial violence this country has ever experienced. I've been thinking a lot about memory, what we remember and what we forget. I've been thinking about the stories that we tell to others and the stories that we tell to ourselves. I've been thinking about what we do with our histories, what we pass on, and what we choose to overlook, and why. And I remember that famous quote, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it.